It was a quiet autumn evening, the kind where the air feels crisp and cool against your skin, and the golden hues of falling leaves make everything seem peaceful. In a small suburban neighborhood in Virginia, the streets were calm, with only the occasional car passing by. The amber glow of streetlights lit up the roads, creating long shadows that danced gently in the breeze. It was the kind of night where you'd expect nothing unusual to happen, but sometimes, life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. General Marcus Reed was driving home after a long day. He had just attended an awards ceremony at Fort Myer, a prestigious event celebrating the achievements of several high-ranking military officers. Dressed in his civilian clothes, dark slacks, a neatly pressed shirt, and polished shoes, he looked every bit the dignified man he was. On his head, he wore his military cap, a subtle yet proud reminder of the decades he had spent serving his country. His black sedan moved smoothly along the road, its tires humming softly against the asphalt as he navigated the familiar route back to his house. Marcus was a man who commanded respect without ever demanding it. At 52 years old, he had earned countless medals and accolades during his 25-year career in the U.S. Army. He had served multiple tours overseas, led thousands of soldiers, and risen through the ranks to become one of the most respected generals in the military. Despite all this, Marcus carried himself with humility. He wasn't the type to boast about his accomplishments or seek attention. Instead, he preferred to focus on doing what was right, whether it was leading troops into battle or mentoring young officers eager to learn from him. As he approached a stoplight, Marcus slowed down, bringing his car to a halt. The light turned green, and he began moving forward again, his mind drifting to thoughts of home. He imagined sitting in his favorite armchair, sipping a cup of coffee, and maybe watching the news before calling it a night. It was a simple plan, but after a day filled with formalities and speeches, it sounded perfect. But then something unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, blue and red flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Marcus frowned slightly, confused. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run any red lights, and certainly hadn't done anything reckless. Still, he knew the drill. Pulling over safely to the side of the road, he rolled down his window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, making sure they were clearly visible. It was always better to be cautious in situations like these. A young police officer stepped out of the patrol car behind him. His name was Officer Dylan Hayes, though Marcus didn't know that yet. Hayes was in his late 20s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a stern expression etched onto his face. As he approached Marcus's car, his movements were brisk and purposeful, almost aggressive. There was no friendly nod or casual greeting, just a cold, hard stare that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "License and registration," Hayes barked, his voice sharp and commanding. He didn't wait for Marcus to respond before leaning closer to peer into the car. His eyes scanned the interior quickly, taking in the general's neat appearance, the military cap perched on the dashboard, and the overall tidiness of the vehicle. Then, without warning, his tone shifted. "You don't look like you belong around here," Hayes said, his words dripping with disdain. His gaze lingered on Marcus's dark skin, and for a moment, the general felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had encountered prejudice before, of course. Over the years, he had learned to recognize the signs, the subtle shift in someone's demeanor, the unspoken assumptions, the thinly veiled hostility. But this felt different. This felt personal. "I'm just heading home, sir," Marcus replied, calmly, keeping his voice steady despite the tension building inside him. "I live nearby. Is there a problem?" Hayes ignored the question. Instead, he took a step back, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice rising slightly. "Now." Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, his mind racing. He understood the importance of complying with law enforcement. It was part of being a responsible citizen, but something about this situation felt off. Still, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. Standing beside his car, he locked eyes with Hayes, trying to project calm and confidence. "What's this about?" Marcus asked again, his tone polite but firm. "Have I done something wrong?" Hayes didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his weapon, drawing it from its holster and pointing it directly at Marcus's chest. The barrel gleamed under the streetlights, a stark contrast to the peaceful surroundings. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let fear take over. Years of training had taught him how to stay composed under pressure, even in moments like this. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Hayes shouted, his voice echoing through the otherwise quiet neighborhood. Passers-by began to notice the scene unfolding. A few cars slowed down as drivers craned their necks to see what was happening. Some people pulled out their phones, capturing videos of the confrontation. Others simply stared, unsure of what to do. Unbeknownst to Hayes, one of those bystanders recognized Marcus immediately. It was Colonel Sarah Bennett, a close friend and colleague of the general. She had been driving home herself when she spotted the commotion. Her stomach dropped as she realized who was standing in the spotlight of the police cruiser's flashing lights. Without hesitation, she pulled over and dialed 911, reporting the incident and requesting backup, not just from local authorities, but also from military personnel stationed nearby. Meanwhile, Hayes continued to bark orders, his body language tense and confrontational. He seemed oblivious to the growing crowd of onlookers, focused solely on intimidating the man in front of him. What he didn't realize, however, was that help was already on the way, and it would arrive sooner than he could have imagined. Marcus, the situation was surreal. Here he was, a decorated Army general with decades of service to his name, being treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. It was a harsh reminder of the realities many Black Americans faced daily, regardless of their status or achievements. Yet even in this moment of injustice, Marcus refused to let anger consume him. He stood tall, his posture unwavering, determined to handle the situation with grace and dignity. Little did Hayes know that his actions were about to set off a chain reaction, one that would change not only his own life but also spark important conversations across the nation. As the tension on the side of the road escalated, Marcus Reed remained eerily calm. His hands were raised slightly, palms open, a universal gesture of peace and compliance. Despite the gun pointed at his chest, he didn't flinch or raise his voice. Instead, he spoke with measured tones, his words deliberate and steady as if trying to defuse a ticking bomb. "Officer," Marcus repeated, his deep voice carrying authority even in such a vulnerable position. "I'm cooperating fully. I've done nothing wrong. Please explain why I've been pulled over." But Officer Hayes wasn't listening. His face was flushed, his jaw clenched tightly as though he was fighting some internal battle. The young officer's grip on his weapon tightened, and he took another step back, putting more distance between himself and Marcus. It was clear that Hayes wasn't interested in explanations, or perhaps he had already made up his mind about who Marcus was, based solely on appearances. "You're suspicious," Hayes snapped, his tone laced with hostility. "Driving too, slow, then stopping abruptly. People don't just sit at green lights unless they're up to something." Marcus blinked, momentarily taken aback by the absurdity of the accusation. He had followed every traffic rule perfectly, obeying the speed limit and coming to a complete stop when required. Yet here he was, being accused of suspicious behavior because of assumptions rooted in bias rather than facts. Before Marcus could respond, however, the sound of tires screeching caught everyone's attention. A sleek black SUV came to a sudden halt behind Hayes's patrol car, its headlights illuminating the scene like floodlights on a stage. Out stepped Colonel Sarah Bennett, her presence commanding immediate respect. Dressed in her military uniform, she moved with purpose, her boots clicking sharply against the pavement as she approached the confrontation. Sarah had known Marcus for years. They had served together on numerous missions, shared countless meals, during deployments, and supported each other through personal struggles. To her, Marcus wasn't just a colleague, he was family. Seeing him standing there, hands raised while a gun was pointed at him, ignited a fire within her, a mix of outrage and protectiveness that burned fiercely. "What's going on here?" Sarah demanded, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere, like a knife. Her eyes locked onto Hayes, who turned toward her with an expression of confusion and irritation. "This is police business, ma'am," Hayes said dismissively, though his confidence wavered slightly under Sarah's piercing gaze. "Please stay back." Sarah ignored him, stepping closer until she stood directly beside Marcus. She placed a protective hand on his shoulder, her stance unwavering. Turning to Hayes, she said firmly, "This man is General Marcus Reed. He's one of the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. Army. Do you understand what you're doing right now?" Hayes faltered, his arm lowering slightly but still holding the gun. His eyes darted between Sarah and Marcus, searching for signs that this might be some elaborate prank. But there was no mistaking the truth written all over their faces, or the insignia on Sarah's uniform. This wasn't just any civilian being questioned on the side of the road. This was someone who commanded entire divisions, someone whose name carried weight far beyond the small suburban neighborhood they were standing in. The crowd of onlookers grew larger as more people noticed the unfolding drama. Some had stopped, their cars entirely, getting out to watch from a safe distance. Others filmed the scene with their phones, capturing every word and movement. Whispers rippled through the gathering crowd. "Is that really a general? Why does the cop have his gun out? This doesn't look right." As the murmurs spread, Hayes began to realize the gravity of the situation. His face flushed red, not just from embarrassment but also from the growing realization that he might have made a catastrophic mistake. Still, pride and fear kept him from backing down completely. He stammered, "Even generals have to follow the law. If he's breaking it, I'll handle it." Sarah's response was swift and unyielding. "Handle it? By threatening him with a firearm? Without probable cause? You've got no idea what you're dealing with here, officer." Just as Hayes opened his mouth to argue, the distant rumble of engines filled the air. Everyone turned to see a convoy of military vehicles approaching, Humvees and trucks emblazoned with the unmistakable insignias of the U.S. Army. The sight was both awe-inspiring and intimidating, a rolling testament to the power and discipline of the armed forces. Soldiers in full uniform spilled out of the vehicles, forming a perimeter around the scene. Their movements were precise, their expressions serious. Among them were two high-ranking officers, Major General Thompson and Brigadier General Lewis, both of whom strode forward with purpose. Major General Thompson, a tall man with graying hair and sharp features, addressed Hayes directly. "Officer, do you know who you're pointing your weapon at?" Hayes swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Nervously, I thought," he stammered, unable to finish his sentence. "You thought wrong," Major General Thompson interrupted, his voice cold and authoritative. "This is General Marcus Reed. He has dedicated decades of his life to serving this country. He has earned medals for bravery and leadership, and you are currently threatening someone who outranks nearly everyone in this state, including you." The weight of those words hit Hayes like a freight train. His hand trembled slightly as he finally lowered the gun entirely, though he still clutched it awkwardly, unsure of what to do next. The reality of his actions began to sink in and the color drained from his face. For the first time since the encounter began, he looked genuinely afraid, not of Marcus but of the consequences of his own prejudice and recklessness. Meanwhile, Marcus stood silently, allowing the events to unfold without saying a word. He didn't need to defend himself. The truth spoke loudly enough. Yet despite the vindication provided by the arrival of his colleagues, he couldn't shake the feeling of disappointment. Disappointment not only in Hayes, but in the systemic issues that allowed moments like this to happen. He had spent his entire career fighting for justice and equality, yet here he was, facing discrimination in broad daylight. Colonel Sarah Bennett stepped forward again, addressing the crowd that had gathered. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice ringing out clearly, "this is General Marcus Reed, a decorated hero of our nation. What you are witnessing tonight is unacceptable. No one, no matter their rank or status, should ever be treated this way." Her words resonated deeply with the onlookers. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered among themselves, and a few even applauded softly. The mood shifted from shock and confusion to anger and solidarity. People began sharing videos and photos online, tagging hashtags like Respect Our Heroes and Justice for Reed. Within minutes, social media platforms lit up with posts about the incident, amplifying the story far beyond the quiet streets of Virginia. Back at the center of the chaos, Hayes struggled to regain control of the situation. He tried to justify his actions, muttering something about protocol and suspicious activity, but his excuses fell flat. Even his fellow officers who had arrived to assist seemed embarrassed by his behavior. One of them quietly suggested he holster his weapon and step aside, which he did reluctantly. As the dust settled, Marcus finally spoke. His voice was soft, but carried immense weight. "Officer Hayes," he said, looking directly into the young man's eyes. "Tonight could have ended very differently. But it didn't. Let this be a lesson for all of us." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. While Hayes stood frozen, overwhelmed by shame and fear, Marcus turned to his colleagues and nodded gratefully. Together, they walked back to the convoy, leaving Hayes and the watching world to reflect on what had just transpired. Though the immediate danger had passed, the ripple effects of the evening were only beginning. For Marcus, this was more than just a personal ordeal. It was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done to bridge divides and foster understanding between communities. And as the convoy drove away, the general knew that this moment would not be forgotten anytime soon. The air was thick with tension as the convoy of military vehicles rolled away, leaving Officer Dylan Hayes standing alone under the harsh glare of headlights and streetlights. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly, as he holstered his gun. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him like an invisible force, making it hard to breathe. For a brief moment, he looked around at the crowd that had gathered, people staring at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright anger, and felt a wave of shame wash over him. But this wasn't just about Hayes anymore. Word of the incident spread faster than wildfire, fueled by smartphones and social media. Videos captured by bystanders showed every detail. The gun pointed at Marcus Reed's chest, Sarah Bennett stepping in with fierce determination, and the arrival of the military convoy that turned the situation on its head. Hashtags like Respect Our Heroes and Justice for Reed began trending nationwide within hours. People were outraged, not only because of the blatant display of prejudice, but also because it involved someone who had dedicated his life to protecting the country. Back at police headquarters, news of the confrontation reached senior officials almost immediately. Captain Linda Morales, the head of Hayes' department, watched one of the viral videos with growing dread. She knew how incidents like this could erode public trust in law enforcement. Worse still, she recognized the potential fallout for her department if they didn't act swiftly and decisively. "Get him in here," Morales barked into her phone, referring to Hayes. "Now." Hayes arrived at the station less than 30 minutes later, escorted by two fellow officers who looked equally embarrassed by his actions. As he walked through the halls, heads turned, whispers followed. Some colleagues avoided eye contact altogether, while others shot him disapproving glances. It was clear that no one wanted to be associated with him right now. Inside Morales' office, the atmosphere was tense. Sitting across from her desk, Hayes fidgeted nervously, unable to meet her gaze. Morales leaned forward, her elbows resting on the polished surface of her desk. Her voice was calm, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut steel. "What were you thinking?" she asked, her tone icy. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but quickly closed it again. He stammered, I thought he was suspicious. He didn't look like he belonged there." Morales raised an eyebrow, incredulous. "Didn't look like he belonged? You pulled your weapon on a decorated Army general, a man who has risked his life countless times for this country, and all you can say is, he didn't look like he belonged?" Her words hit Hayes like a punch to the gut. He slumped back in his chair, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his mistake. Morales continued, her voice rising slightly. You've put this entire department in jeopardy. Thanks to you, we're going to be under scrutiny from every corner, the media, politicians, advocacy groups, and worst of all, you've damaged the relationship between law enforcement and the community. As she spoke, Hayes's mind raced. He tried to justify his actions in his head, replaying the events over and over. But no matter how many times he went through it, one thing became painfully clear. He hadn't acted based on facts or evidence. He had acted out of bias, letting preconceived notions cloud his judgment. That realization made him feel even smaller than before. Meanwhile, outside the station, reporters had already set up camp. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like mechanical flowers searching for sunlight. Microphones and cameras jutted out toward anyone willing to comment. Residents of the neighborhood came forward recounting what they had seen. One elderly woman tearfully described how she had been walking her dog when she witnessed the scene unfold. "That poor man," she said, shaking her head. "He didn't deserve that. Not here, not anywhere." Others echoed her sentiments, condemning Hayes's behavior and calling for accountability. Social media exploded with reactions too. Thousands of comments poured in, some supportive of Marcus Reed, others demanding justice. Influencers and activists used their platforms to amplify the story, urging people to demand systemic change. Even politicians weighed in, issuing statements condemning racial profiling and pledging support for reforms. General Marcus Reed, however, remained remarkably composed throughout the chaos. Back at his home, surrounded by close friends and colleagues, he reflected on the night's events. Despite the gravity of the situation, he refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, he saw it as an opportunity, a chance to spark meaningful conversations and drive progress. "I've faced discrimination before," Marcus admitted during a quiet moment with Sarah Bennett. "It's never easy, but each time it happens, I remind myself that staying calm and focused is the best way to fight back. Tonight, I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was standing up for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "You handled it beautifully, Marcus. But don't think for a second that this ends here. We need to use this moment to push for real change." And so, plans were set in motion. Early the next morning, Marcus met with military leaders and civil rights advocates to discuss next steps. They drafted a statement addressing the incident, emphasizing the importance of mutual respect between law enforcement and the communities they served. They also announced plans to collaborate with local police departments to implement implicit bias training programs and improve accountability measures. By midday, the statement was released to the press, drawing widespread praise. General Marcus Reed became a symbol of resilience and dignity, his name synonymous with grace under pressure. People admired not only his composure during the ordeal, but also his willingness to turn a negative experience into something positive. 4. Officer Hayes, the consequences were swift and severe. After hours of questioning and review, senior officials decided to relieve him of duty pending a full investigation. His badge and gun were confiscated, and he was placed on administrative leave. The decision sent shockwaves through the department, serving as a stark reminder that no one was above accountability, not even those sworn to uphold the law. As the day wore on, Hayes sat alone in his apartment, staring blankly at the wall. The enormity of his mistake gnawed at him, eating away at his confidence and self-worth. He replayed the events in his mind, wondering where things had gone so horribly wrong. Had he been blinded by prejudice? Was he simply unprepared for the complexities of modern policing? Whatever the reasons, he knew one thing for certain: he would carry the weight of this night for the rest of his life. While Hayes wrestled with guilt and regret, the world moved on. Conversations about race, policing, and systemic inequality dominated headlines and dinner tables alike. Schools held discussions about implicit bias, and community organizations organized rallies calling for reform. What started as a single act of prejudice had ignited a national dialogue, one that refused to fade quietly into the background. For General Marcus Reed, the journey was far from over. He understood that true change wouldn't come overnight, but he was determined to play his part in shaping a better future. With unwavering resolve, he vowed to continue fighting, not just for himself but for everyone who deserved to live in a world free from fear and discrimination. And as the sun rose on a new day, casting golden light over the same suburban streets where the confrontation had taken place, hope lingered in the air. Hope that moments like these could serve as catalyst for transformation. Hope that even in the darkest times, humanity could find a way to rise above. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of activity, both for General Marcus Reed and the wider community. The story continued to dominate headlines, sparking debates in living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces across the nation. People couldn't stop talking about what had happened and, more importantly, why it had happened. For many, the confrontation between Officer Dylan Hayes and General Reed served as a stark reminder of the deep-seated biases that still lingered in society. It wasn't just an isolated event. It was a symptom of something much larger, something systemic. Marcus found himself at the center of this storm, not because he sought attention, but because people naturally gravitated toward his calm and dignified demeanor. He became a symbol of resilience, a man who had faced injustice head-on without losing his composure or compromising his values. Reporters hounded him for interviews, activists begged him to lend his voice to their causes, and ordinary citizens reached out to express their gratitude for how he handled the situation. But despite the growing spotlight, Marcus remained grounded. He knew the focus shouldn't be on him alone. It needed to be on the bigger picture. "I'm just one person," Marcus told Sarah Bennett during a quiet moment at his home. "This isn't about me being a general or having medals. This is about fairness, respect, and accountability. If we don't address these issues now, they'll keep happening." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're right. But your platform gives us a chance to make real change. You can't ignore that." With Sarah's encouragement, Marcus agreed to take action, but on his terms. Rather than seeking revenge or punishment for Officer Hayes personally, he focused on using the incident as a catalyst for reform. Over the next few days, he met with leaders from various organizations, civil rights groups, military officials, educators, and even representatives from law enforcement agencies to discuss ways to bridge gaps and foster understanding between communities and police forces. One of the first steps Marcus took was testifying before Congress. Standing in front of lawmakers, he recounted the events of that fateful night with honesty and clarity. His testimony was powerful not because of dramatic language or emotional appeals, but because of its simplicity and authenticity. He spoke about how it felt to be treated like a criminal, simply because of the color of his skin. He described the fear and frustration he experienced when a gun was pointed at him, knowing full well that the outcome could have been tragically different, and he emphasized the importance of addressing implicit bias within law enforcement, not to vilify officers but to help them serve their communities better. "It's not enough to say most cops are good," Marcus said during his speech. "We need systems in place to ensure that every single officer understands the impact of their actions. Bias exists, whether we want to admit it or not. The question is, are we willing to confront it?" His words resonated deeply with those in attendance. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle praised his courage and commitment to positive change. Some promised to push for legislation aimed at improving training programs for police officers, while others pledged to allocate funding for community outreach initiatives. Though progress would take time, Marcus's testimony planted seeds of hope that meaningful reforms might finally be within reach. Meanwhile, the fallout for Officer Dylan Hayes intensified. Stripped of his badge and placed on indefinite leave, Hayes struggled to cope with the consequences of his actions. News outlets painted him as the face of unchecked prejudice, dissecting his behavior and questioning his fitness to wear a uniform. Social media users piled on, flooding comment sections with criticism and ridicule. Some called for harsher punishments, demanding that Hayes face criminal charges, while others argued that his case highlighted the urgent need for better vetting and training processes within police departments. But amidst all the noise there were also quieter voices advocating for a different approach. Activists and experts urged people to see Hayes not as a monster, but as a product of flawed systems. They pointed out that while his actions were unacceptable, they weren't entirely unique. Countless other officers had acted similarly in moments of heightened tension, often without facing the same level of scrutiny. Instead of focusing solely on punishing Hayes, they argued, efforts should be directed toward preventing such incidents from happening again. Hayes himself was a broken man. Days turned into weeks, and he spent most of his time holed up in his apartment, consumed by guilt and regret. He replayed the confrontation over and over in his mind, analyzing every decision he'd made that night. What if he hadn't drawn his weapon? What if he had listened to Marcus instead of jumping to conclusions? These questions haunted him, keeping him awake at night. Eventually, Hayes decided to seek counseling. At first, he resisted the idea, convinced that therapy wouldn't undo the damage he had caused. But after a heartfelt conversation with a former mentor, a retired detective who had once walked a similar path, Hayes realized that ignoring his emotions wouldn't solve anything. Slowly, he began opening up about his fears, insecurities, and biases. It was painful work, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the profession he had once held dear. But it was also necessary. As Hayes worked through his struggles privately, the public discourse shifted slightly. While outrage over the incident remained palpable, some segments of society started focusing on solutions rather than blame. Community forums sprang up in cities nationwide, bringing together police officers, activists, and everyday citizens to engage in open dialogues. Schools incorporated lessons on empathy and cultural sensitivity into their curriculums, teaching students the value of treating others with kindness and respect regardless of differences. Nonprofit organizations launched campaigns aimed at promoting diversity within law enforcement ranks, arguing that representation mattered just as much as policy changes. General Marcus Reed played an active role in many of these efforts. He traveled extensively, speaking at conferences, town halls, and universities about the importance of unity and understanding. Everywhere he went, crowds greeted him with applause and admiration, thanking him for using his experience to drive positive change. Yet Marcus never let the praise go to his head. He remained humble, always redirecting attention back to the collective struggle for justice. One particularly memorable event took place in Washington, D.C., where Marcus joined a panel discussion alongside civil rights leaders, law enforcement, officials, and survivors of police misconduct. The room buzzed with energy as participants shared stories, insights, and ideas. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stood tall, his presence commanding instant silence. "This fight isn't mine alone," he began, his voice steady and strong. "It belongs to all of us. To the mothers who've lost sons, to the children who've grown up fearing authority, to the officers who genuinely want to protect and serve. We must come together, not as adversaries but as allies, if we hope to build a future where everyone feels safe and valued." His words brought tears to the eyes of many in the audience. For the first time in a long while, people felt hopeful that change was possible, hopeful that humanity could rise above its flaws, and hopeful that stories like Marcus's would inspire others to stand firm in the face of adversity. As the months passed, the immediate shock of the incident faded, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Laws were introduced to mandate regular bias training for police officers. Departments implemented stricter oversight measures to hold individuals accountable for discriminatory behavior. Communities organized neighborhood watch programs and citizen advisory boards to foster transparency and trust. While none of these changes erased centuries of inequality overnight, they represented significant steps forward. For Marcus Reed, the journey was far from over. He understood that true equality required constant vigilance and effort, but he also believed that progress, no matter how incremental, was worth celebrating. As he looked out at the world around him, one still imperfect, but undeniably moving toward a brighter future, he allowed himself a small smile. The road ahead would be challenging, yes, but it was a road paved with hope. And that, he knew, made all the difference. As the weeks turned into months, General Marcus Reed's story continued to inspire people across the nation. What had started as a single harrowing incident on a quiet suburban road had grown into something much larger, a movement for accountability, equality, and systemic reform. The ripple effects of that night reached far beyond Virginia, touching lives in cities and towns nationwide. For Marcus, this wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about using his platform to create lasting change. One of the first major initiatives Marcus spearheaded was a national campaign called Respect and Protect, aimed at fostering better relationships between law enforcement officers and the communities they served. The program focused on 3 key areas: education, dialogue, and action. Through workshops, town hall meetings, and online resources, Marcus worked tirelessly to educate both citizens and police officers about the importance of mutual respect and understanding. He believed that meaningful conversations could break down barriers and build trust where none existed before. The workshops were particularly impactful. Officers from various departments attended sessions designed to help them recognize and address their own implicit biases. These weren't lectures or finger-pointing exercises. They were collaborative discussions led by experts in psychology, sociology, and conflict resolution. Participants shared stories, asked tough questions, and learned practical strategies for de-escalating tense situations without resorting to force. Many officers admitted afterward that the experience had changed how they viewed their roles in society. "It's not just about enforcing laws," one officer said during a post-workshop interview. "It's about serving people with empathy and fairness." For community members, the workshops provided an opportunity to voice their concerns directly to law enforcement officials. Some attendees spoke about past encounters with police that had left them feeling unsafe or disrespected. Others shared positive experiences, highlighting moments when officers had gone above and beyond to help. These exchanges humanized both sides, reminding everyone involved that behind the uniforms and badges were individuals trying to do their best in difficult circumstances. In addition to the workshops, Marcus also launched a mentorship program, connecting young people from marginalized communities with retired military personnel and seasoned law enforcement professionals. The goal was simple yet profound: to show kids who might otherwise feel alienated from authority figures that there were good people working within those systems, people who cared deeply about making a difference. Over time, these mentoring relationships blossomed into friendships, creating bridges where divides once stood. But Marcus didn't stop there. Knowing that policy changes were essential for long-term progress, he partnered with lawmakers to draft legislation addressing systemic issues in policing. One of the most significant bills introduced was the Accountability in Action Act, which mandated body cameras for all officers, established independent review boards to investigate misconduct allegations, and required annual bias training certifications. While passing such comprehensive reforms wasn't easy, opponents argued that they would burden already stretched thin departments. The overwhelming public support made it clear that change was inevitable. The bill passed after months of heated debates and negotiations, marking a historic victory for advocates of justice reform. When the President signed it into law, Marcus stood beside him at the ceremony, his presence a testament to the power of perseverance and unity. As cameras flashed and applause filled the room, Marcus reflected on how far they'd come since that fateful night. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, resistance, and moments of doubt, but seeing tangible results gave him hope for the future. Meanwhile, Officer Dylan Hayes' life took a dramatically different trajectory. After completing counseling and undergoing intensive retraining, Hayes decided to step away from law enforcement altogether. Though some criticized him for quitting instead of staying to fix the system from within, Hayes knew it was the right decision, not just for himself but for the people he might encounter in the line of duty. "I let my biases cloud my judgment," he admitted during a rare interview. "And because of that, I almost destroyed someone's life. I'll carry that guilt forever. But maybe, just maybe, I can find a way to make amends." Hayes eventually found work as a counselor for troubled youth, channeling his experiences into helping others navigate challenges similar to those he had faced. His journey wasn't easy. He often grappled with feelings of inadequacy and shame, but he refused to give up. Slowly, he began rebuilding his life, piece by piece, determined to prove that redemption was possible even after grave mistakes. Back, in the public eye, Marcus continued to advocate for change, though he did so with characteristic humility. He never sought recognition or accolades. His motivation came purely from a desire to leave the world better than he found it. Yet recognition found him nonetheless. Awards poured in from organizations around the globe, praising his leadership, courage, and commitment to justice. Schools named auditoriums and scholarships after him, ensuring that future generations would remember his contributions. Despite the accolades, Marcus remained steadfast in his belief that true success lay not in individual achievements, but in collective progress. "This isn't about me," he told reporters repeatedly. "It's about every person who deserves to live free from fear and discrimination. If we keep pushing forward together, we can achieve incredible things." By the end of the year, the impact of Marcus's efforts was undeniable. Police-community relations showed measurable improvement in several cities, thanks in part to programs inspired by Respect and Protect. More women and minorities joined law enforcement ranks, bringing fresh perspectives and greater representation. And perhaps most importantly, conversations about race and inequality became more open and honest, breaking down walls that had stood for generations. Still, Marcus understood that the fight was far from over. Systemic issues couldn't be solved overnight, and complacency remained one of the greatest threats to progress. So he kept pushing, kept advocating, kept inspiring others to join the cause. Whether speaking at rallies, meeting with government officials, or simply chatting with neighbors, he reminded everyone that change required constant effort and that each person had a role to play. On a crisp autumn evening, 1 year to the day since the incident, Marcus returned to the same suburban street where it all began. This time, however, the atmosphere was vastly different. Instead of tension and hostility, there was warmth and camaraderie. Residents had organized a community event to celebrate the strides they'd made over the past year. Food trucks lined the streets. Children played games under twinkling string. Lights and laughter echoed through the air. Standing atop a small stage set up near the spot where he had been pulled over, Marcus addressed the crowd. His voice carried strength and resolve, but also gratitude for the resilience of the human spirit, for the power of unity, and for the unwavering belief that brighter days lay ahead. "A year ago, I stood here facing fear and prejudice," he began, pausing to let his words sink in. "Tonight, I stand here surrounded by love and hope. That doesn't mean our work is done. It means we've proven that change is possible. Together, we've shown what happens when we refuse to accept injustice. We've reminded ourselves that no matter how dark things may seem, light always finds a way to shine through." As the crowd erupted in cheers, Marcus smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. He knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, twists, and turns. But standing there, surrounded by friends, allies, and strangers turned family, he felt confident that they could face whatever came next. Because in the end, it wasn't about one man or one moment. It was about the countless acts of courage, compassion, and determination that added up to something extraordinary. And so, General Marcus Reed walked off the stage, ready to continue the journey. One step at a time, one conversation at a time, one heart at a time, he moved forward, carrying the torch of hope for a brighter, fairer tomorrow.